Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
It was one of those evenings that looked perfect on the outside. The dining room was lit with warm bulbs overhead, the kind that made every photo come out looking like a Hallmark card. My sister Claire's kids were chasing each other around the kitchen island, their high-pitched giggles echoing off the walls like some soundtrack to a fake commercial. The table was set with Eleanor's wedding china, Mom's pride, and there was a carrot cake in the center with Happy 42nd, Marissa, written in swirly pink frosting that looked like it had been piped by a teenager on her first day at a bakery. Everything, in theory, should have felt celebratory, intimate, even loving. But then she said it. It was right after the toast. She raised her glass, half full with boxed Chardonnay, and tapped her spoon against it 3 times like we were at some fancy wedding. She stood up, the matriarch of this broken little clan, wearing that smug, nostalgic smile she always wore when she was about to pretend like she was being sincere. "I just want to say," she started, pausing for dramatic effect, "how proud I am to have 2 such different daughters. Claire, of course, has always been, well, Claire, brilliant, organized, thoughtful, the kind of woman who makes everyone around her better. And Marissa," she looked at me then. I was already mid-sip of my wine, the good kind I'd brought myself, because I knew better than to expect anything decent from her fridge. "Well," she continued, "I don't know how we ended up with 1 golden child and 1, well." That's all she said. Just well. She let the silence hang there like a sour smell. No one laughed. No one moved. Claire cleared her throat like she was going to step in, but instead, she looked down at her plate, pretending to fuss with her napkin like she didn't hear a goddamn thing. Her husband Tom stared into his beer. My Aunt Leslie, my mom's older sister, shifted in her chair and gave me a long, loaded glance, the kind that says, "I see it, I always have, but it's not my place." I laughed. I actually fucking laughed. I smiled real wide, picked up the knife, and cut the damn cake. I even made a joke about it. "Well, this golden child's cake is a little dry," I said, and a few people chuckled politely, relieved that I'd decided not to flip the table. That's what everyone was waiting for after all. The Marissa meltdown. The moment the less-than daughter finally snapped after 4 decades of being the family's afterthought. But I didn't give it to them. Not that night. Instead, I lit my own candles, let the kids sing me happy birthday in that screechy off-key tone only kids can pull off, and I blew them out. I made a wish. And it wasn't a nice one. When I got home that night, I kicked off my shoes by the door and stood in the dark of my 1-bedroom apartment above the floral shop I own alone, not lonely, but tired in the way that only years of quiet humiliation can make you. I poured myself another glass of wine and opened the group text my family had made for the party. Nothing. No, thank you for coming, no, great cake, not even a fucking emoji. Just silence, like we were all pretending the night hadn't ended with an emotional drive-by. Then, just before midnight, I got a private message from Jake, my cousin, Leslie's son, and probably the only person in this family I could talk to without immediately feeling like I was being judged on a scale from 1 to Claire. It just said, "What did you say to your mom? She's been a mess since last night." I stared at it for a full minute. My phone screen glowed in the dark like some kind of uninvited witness. I didn't reply right away. I didn't even type a single word. Because the truth was I hadn't said anything. Not to her, not yet. But something had shifted. I felt it. Like the ground beneath the family dinner table had cracked just slightly. And maybe all I had to do was press my heel down and watch it split open completely. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. I didn't bother opening the shop. I just sat there, in my kitchen, staring at an old family photo from a Christmas in the late 80s. Me in a homemade sweater, Claire in a store-bought dress, Mom between us with a hand on Claire's shoulder and the other one nowhere near mine. And I thought about that word she used, golden. Like I was a rusted coin next to a trophy. I'd spent years trying not to believe what was obvious. That I was tolerated, not loved. That every success of mine had to be compared, then diminished. That when I got divorced, Mom called it a bump in the road, but when Claire's husband lost his job for 6 months, it was a family crisis. That no matter what I did, build my own business, pay my own way, show up for every goddamn family event, it would never be enough to outshine the child she'd already decided was the winner. So I started thinking. Not about revenge, not exactly. I wasn't going to pour bleach in anyone's shampoo or post family secrets on Facebook like some high school drama queen. But I was done pretending. Done smiling through the digs and laughing off the insults. I wanted the truth. I wanted to understand why. And if she didn't want to tell me, I'd find out on my own. I opened my phone again and stared at Jake's message. The more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. Why was she a mess? What was there to be a mess about, unless she knew something was coming? Unless, maybe, she wasn't as sure of her role in all this as she pretended to be. Maybe she felt that shift too. Maybe she had finally realized that I wasn't going to play the lesser child anymore, and maybe that scared her more than anything. So I replied, "Did she say what was wrong?" Jake wrote back immediately. "She kept saying she knows. She knows." I saw it in her face. And just like that, I understood something I hadn't before. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to explain. All I needed was to look her in the eye and let her see that I'd stopped playing along. Because that's the thing about golden children, they shine because someone else is holding them up to the light. But once you put the light down, all that glitter starts to look a lot like guilt. There's a specific kind of memory that doesn't arrive gently, doesn't knock first, and doesn't wait to be welcomed. It barges in, muddy shoes and all, with the audacity of someone who's been standing outside your mind for too long, waiting for the door to crack just enough to slip through, and once it's in, it refuses to leave quietly. That's what happened to me the morning after the party. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee gone cold, staring through the streaked window at the alley behind the shop, the sky that washed out everything in that muted gray that always makes the world feel like it's been put on pause, and without warning, the past began arriving like a parade of ghosts with perfect posture. I remembered being 11, sitting in the school auditorium in an itchy velvet dress, my legs swinging beneath the folding chair because they didn't quite touch the floor yet, waiting for my name to be called at the end-of-year talent show awards. I'd sung a folk song, nothing flashy, just me and my acoustic guitar, but it had taken me months to gather the nerve, and I still remember the way my voice trembled on the high notes. When they handed me the second-place ribbon, I scanned the crowd, looking for my mother's face. She wasn't there. She had left an hour earlier, after Claire's ballet routine, which had ended with her falling off the stage mid-pirouette and bursting into tears. Eleanor had scooped her up, fussed over her like she was made of porcelain, and never came back. I walked home with the ribbon in my backpack and a lump in my throat the size of a fist, telling myself it didn't matter, that Claire had just needed her more. Then came the Christmas of '96. I was 17. I had saved up for weeks working part-time at the diner on Main, wrapping silverware in napkins and smiling at men who looked at me too long, just so I could buy Mom a real leather wallet she'd once pointed at in the window of Ashford's department store. Claire gave her a watercolor she'd made in art class. Guess which gift got passed around to everyone in the room? Mom cried over the painting. "It's so emotional," she said, holding it like it might break in her hands. The wallet? She left it in the gift bag, tag still on. She used it once, maybe twice, before giving it to Aunt Leslie the following Easter. Leslie told me later she'd found a $20 bill tucked inside with a note that said, "Buy something special, just not practical." That was Eleanor in a nutshell, every kindness filtered through a lens of judgment, every compliment barbed with implication. Claire could bring home a B- in math and she'd get a warm, "You tried your best." I brought home straight A's and was told not to let it go to my head. Claire got her first boyfriend in college and Eleanor offered to help plan their anniversary weekend. I started dating a guy named Steven when I was 25, and when I introduced him to the family, she pulled me aside and said, "He's not really your type. He seems like he thinks too much." But the moment that still haunts me clear as crystal, sharp as glass, was the night after Dad's funeral. Claire had cried through the whole service, delicate and tragic, surrounded by a sea of supportive arms. I had stood mostly still, hands clenched, trying not to collapse under the weight of watching the only person who ever looked at me like I was enough lowered into the ground. That night, Mom poured herself 2 fingers of whiskey, sat down beside me on the couch, and said, "I hope you're not going to use this as an excuse to spiral. You've always been the dramatic one." I should have said something then. I should have stood up and screamed that I wasn't spiraling, that grief isn't a performance, that not everyone wails and clutches at gravestones to prove they feel. But I didn't. I swallowed it. Like always. And I let her believe what she wanted to believe, because fighting her always felt like shouting into a well. You only hear your own voice echoing back, hollow and exhausted. I don't know what's worse, knowing you're unloved or suspecting it for so long that you begin to gaslight yourself into thinking you imagined it. There were good moments, sure. She made me soup when I had the flu. She braided my hair when I was little. She came to my college graduation, sat in the back, clapped politely. But the thing is, kindness without warmth feels more like an obligation than love. It's a checklist. A performative gesture. And I had spent decades convincing myself that maybe I just wasn't wired right to feel her affection, that maybe I'd missed it somehow, like a radio dial a few clicks off. But now, standing in the ruins of another birthday reduced to a punchline, I wasn't so sure. Maybe she never tried. Maybe she just decided early on that Claire was the daughter she wanted, and I was the one she got. So I called Leslie. I don't know why. Maybe because she was the only adult in our family who ever looked at me like she actually saw me. She picked up on the third ring, her voice warm and laced with the kind of caution people use when they've lived around too many secrets. "I've been waiting for you to call," she said. I didn't ask how she knew. I just told her what happened. Word for word. The toast. The silence. The look on Claire's face. And Leslie was quiet for a long time before she finally spoke. "You know your mother's always been scared of you," she said, her voice low. I let that sentence sit there, confused and not quite sure if I'd heard her right. What the hell does that mean? She's scared of the version of you that doesn't need her approval. The part of you that asks questions she doesn't want to answer. You've always been the one with eyes too sharp, ears too tuned in. You saw through her when no one else did. I pressed my fingers to my temples. That doesn't explain why she's spent her life treating me like a guest in my own family. No, Leslie said quietly, but it might explain why she's afraid of what happens now that you've stopped pretending you're okay with it. After we hung up, I sat in silence for a long time, thinking about all the things I'd tried to forget. And it hit me, not like a slap, but like a slow cold draft from an open window, that maybe Mom's toast wasn't a slip of the tongue. Maybe it was a test. One last chance to see if I'd bend, if I'd laugh it off again, if I'd keep swallowing the same old poison like I had since I was a kid. And when I didn't, when I cut that cake with a smile that didn't reach my eyes, she panicked. Because I had stopped playing along. Because I knew. And whatever it was that I had unknowingly cracked open with my silence at that table, it was already spreading through her like a leak behind a wall. And now, for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what I'd find. I was afraid of how far I was willing to go to find it. There are certain houses that stop feeling like homes the moment you leave them behind, and my mother's was one of those. It had the same beige carpet from the early 90s, the same outdated wallpaper in the hallway with the faint floral pattern that never matched anything else, and the same ceramic angel figurines lining the top of the living room bookshelf like silent witnesses to decades of polite tension and thinly veiled disappointment. And yet, as I stood in front of her front door on that gray Tuesday afternoon, key in hand, heart strangely calm, I didn't feel like I was trespassing, not really. I felt like I was returning to a crime scene where the blood had long since dried, but the guilt still clung to the walls like smoke. I hadn't called ahead. I knew she had her weekly church luncheon, an ironclad ritual Eleanor never missed unless death or fire interfered, and I also knew she always left the house at exactly 11:30, which gave me roughly an hour and a half to be in and out. I wasn't there to vandalize, to snoop out of spite, or even to prove a point. I was there because I had questions that no one seemed willing to answer, and it had become increasingly clear to me that if I wanted the truth, whatever version of it still existed, I would have to dig it out myself. The house smelled the same as it always had, a blend of lemon cleaner, potpourri, and something faintly stale, like old secrets that had been stored in airtight containers for too long. I didn't linger. I walked directly to the hallway closet, the one by the guest bathroom, the one we were never allowed to touch as kids without explicit permission. She used to say it was where she kept important documents and seasonal items, but we all knew it was more than that. The closet had always had an aura of sacredness, like it held more than just tax returns and Christmas tree skirts. It held history. I pulled over the step stool from the laundry room, climbed up slowly, and reached above the top shelf, behind a stack of moth-eaten towels and a dusty box labeled Claire's baby clothes. And there it was. The tin box. It was exactly as I remembered, green with gold trim, a clasp in the front, and the unmistakable heaviness that came from knowing this wasn't just storage, this was preservation. This was curation. This was Eleanor's archive of family mythology, curated and protected like the truth might crumble if exposed to air. The box was locked, but I had come prepared. I had watched enough YouTube videos the night before to know how to pop a basic padlock using a bobby pin and a flathead screwdriver. It took me 5 minutes, 2 slips of the wrist, and 1 deep breath. When it clicked open, the sound was so soft, so anticlimactic, I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, how easily some things fall apart when you stop being afraid of touching them. Inside, I found what I expected at first: birth certificates, hospital bracelets, old birthday cards from dead relatives, a newspaper clipping about Claire winning a spelling bee in 4th grade. But beneath that, under a manila envelope labeled private, I found something that made my breath catch in my throat, not because I understood it immediately, but because my body seemed to recognize the weight of it before my mind did. A paternity test. At first, I assumed it was mine, though the name on the envelope wasn't labeled. But as I scanned the printed results, a phrase jumped out at me like a slap across the face: inconclusive, possible sibling mismatch. My fingers went cold. I read it again and then a 3rd time, trying to process the implications. The document didn't say much. It was dated over 30 years ago, when Claire would have been barely 8. It didn't name a father. It just outlined a result that didn't quite fit, didn't quite match, didn't quite make sense. Underneath that, folded in thirds like a letter you forget to send but never quite throw away, was a page of my father's handwriting, familiar, tight script with slightly uneven lines. My heart clenched before I even read a word, because I hadn't seen anything he'd written in years, and his voice, even in ink, still carried that quiet dignity that used to make me feel safe in rooms where my mother only made me feel tolerated. The letter was short, honest, brutal. I'll raise Claire as my own, but don't ever expect me to lie to Marissa. That was it. No context. No signature. No date. Just 1 line. It felt like the floor under my stomach dropped out. I sat back on the step stool, gripping the paper like it might blow away, and tried to breathe through the realization that something I had always sensed, not quite consciously, but deep in the recesses of my intuition, had just been confirmed in the coldest, clearest way possible. Claire wasn't my father's daughter. And my mother had known. Not only had she known, she had hidden it, buried it, probably built half our lives on the idea that the truth would stay quietly locked in a box behind some old towels in a closet no one touched. And the worst part wasn't even the lie, it was the favoritism. The praise. The way she had spent our entire lives lifting Claire up while cutting me down, like she needed to compensate for something, or worse, punish me for being his. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just sat there, shaking, while a storm I didn't even know I'd been holding back finally made landfall in the center of my chest. After a while, I stood up, folded the documents back into the envelope, and replaced them in the box. But not before I took a photo. Just one. For my records. For when the time came that someone tried to call me a liar. And then I did something I can't fully explain even now. I printed a fake version of the letter from Dad. Not a forgery, not a perfect replica, but close enough to pass at a glance. I changed the wording. Slightly. Just enough. Instead of "Don't ever expect me to lie to Marissa," I wrote, I'll raise Claire as my own, but I don't know if Marissa will ever forgive you for this. Then I slipped the fake into the box and locked it back up. I left the house exactly the way I found it. Quiet, stale, and haunted. Only now, I wasn't the ghost anymore. I was the one holding the candle, walking through the dark, ready to set the next match to something that had been rotting from the inside for far too long. The invitation came 2 days later, slipped into my voicemail like a silk glove over a clenched fist, casual in tone but suspicious in timing, as if my mother had suddenly remembered I existed and wanted to wrap that memory in teacups and pastries, hoping I might forget what I had never been allowed to know in the first place. Her voice, syrupy but thin, carried the weight of something unspoken, something uneasy, a kind of forced brightness that anyone else might mistake for warmth, but which I had long since learned to interpret as the signal of a loaded agenda. I thought it would be nice if the three of us had a little afternoon together, she said, pausing just long enough before adding, just the girls. Like old times. There were no old times worth remembering. Not with the three of us. Not with me always 2 steps outside the circle, invited but not embraced, tolerated but not trusted, as if my presence was a formality rather than a desire. Still, I agreed. Not out of politeness or nostalgia, but because I needed to see her eyes. I needed to look directly into them and watch what flickered there when I laid the right words in front of her, just enough to nudge the edges of her comfort without tearing the whole thing apart yet. It was a Saturday afternoon, unseasonably warm, with the kind of thick, expectant air that hangs around before a storm that refuses to arrive. I wore a light cardigan, minimal makeup, and a smile that said, "I know something you don't," which, for once, was entirely true. When I pulled into the driveway, Claire's SUV was already parked neatly beside the curb, as if she'd arrived precisely on time like the dutiful daughter she had always been trained to be. Her children were with her husband for the weekend, something she had mentioned in a group text with no punctuation and too many exclamation points, a digital mask over what I now suspected was a growing unease she didn't know how to name. The table was set on the patio, all floral linens and mismatched china, the kind of curated disorder that pretends to be charming but actually screams control. There was lemon cake, fresh berries, cucumber sandwiches with crusts removed, and a silver tea set that hadn't seen daylight since our father's memorial. Eleanor sat in the center, queen of her porcelain kingdom, with Claire to her right and a third chair, mine, waiting with a faint smear of something white on the back, as if someone had tried to clean it in a hurry and hadn't done a particularly good job. We exchanged pleasantries. Weather. Work. The price of gas. Claire talked about the school fundraiser she was chairing and how exhausting it had been, though somehow she still looked flawless, skin glowing, teeth gleaming. Her voice lined with that polished composure that always made people assume she was as put together on the inside as she appeared on the outside. I let her talk, sipping my tea in measured doses, waiting for the cracks to widen. It didn't take long. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her saucer trembling slightly as she placed it on the table, and looked between us with a wistfulness that felt artificial, like someone rehearsing a line from a play they didn't quite believe in anymore. "I've been feeling strange lately," she said, her fingers twitching slightly near her lap, eyes flicking toward me and then back to Claire. "Like something in this house is shifting. Energy, maybe. Or just the air." Claire smiled, ever the obliging daughter, and said something bland about the seasons changing. I waited a beat, then placed my cup down gently and looked straight at Eleanor. "Funny," I said, letting the words stretch, casual and sharp. "I was thinking about Dad the other day. About how he used to talk to me when no one else was around. He always had this look in his eyes when Claire walked into the room. Not bad, just distant. Detached. You remember that?" Eleanor's jaw stiffened. Her hands clasped tightly, one over the other, knuckles going pale. Claire tilted her head, confused, the smile faltering just slightly. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice still light but with an edge of caution, the kind that shows up when someone senses danger but hasn't yet identified the source. "Oh, nothing," I replied smoothly, as I picked up a strawberry and bit into it, the sweetness cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "Just memories." Dad always said the past has a funny way of leaking back into the room when you least expect it. Eleanor let out a breath that was almost a whisper. You don't know what you're saying, she murmured, eyes cast down at her plate. Claire looked between us, more alarmed now. Wait, she said, sitting straighter, her voice louder. What is this? I turned to her then, slow and deliberate, letting my gaze linger a moment too long. You ever feel like you were raised in a story someone wrote for you? I asked her. Like every part of your life was part of a script? The golden child. The perfect wife. The daughter who could do no wrong. Claire blinked. Marissa, what are you talking about? Eleanor stood up suddenly, her chair scraping harshly against the flagstones. That's enough, she said, not loud but forceful, her voice cracking in the middle. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I won't allow it. I leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, letting the silence thicken. No game, I said quietly. Just asking questions. Isn't that what family's for? The breeze shifted, stirring the tablecloth, sending a napkin fluttering to the ground. No one moved to pick it up. Claire looked at me then, her eyes searching, mouth slightly open as if she was on the verge of understanding something, but hadn't yet found the words to give it shape. Are you trying to tell me something? She asked. I met her gaze, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of fear behind her calm. Not fear of me, but fear of something deeper, older, something that might rewrite everything she thought she knew about who we were. I didn't answer her question. I just reached for my tea and took another sip. Eleanor's voice dropped so low I barely heard it, but it landed like a stone in a still pond. You don't know, do you? Claire turned to her sharply. Know what? Eleanor didn't respond. She sat back down, hands trembling, eyes fixed on the center of the table as though if she stared hard enough, the truth would bury itself again. And I knew then, with absolute clarity, that the box wasn't just a relic of a lie, it was a crack in the dam. One I had no intention of sealing back up. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the quiet that comes before a reckoning. It was barely 8 the next morning when I heard the knock, sharp, persistent, impatient in that way only family can manage without it tipping into rudeness. I was still in my robe, coffee untouched, standing barefoot in the middle of my kitchen with a strange mix of nerves and satisfaction humming beneath my skin, like I'd finally fired the first real shot in a war that had been quietly waged for over 30 years. I didn't need to check the peephole. I already knew who it was. Claire. When I opened the door, she pushed past me without a word, her oversized sunglasses perched on her head like armor, her ponytail just a little too tight, her movements clipped, controlled, surgical. Everything about her radiated the kind of frantic composure of someone who had just discovered a loose thread in the hem of her life and was now unraveling in real time. She didn't sit down, didn't accept the coffee I offered, didn't even look at me for the first 30 seconds. She just stood there in the middle of my living room like she'd stumbled into a crime scene, and maybe, in her mind, she had. What did you do? She finally said, her voice low, sharp, like she was trying not to scream and failing at it anyway. What the hell did you say to her? I leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, not out of defiance, but because I didn't trust myself to speak just yet without sounding like I was enjoying this too much. And the truth was I wasn't. This wasn't victory. This wasn't vindication. It was just the inevitable consequence of asking questions no one wanted to answer and watching the fragile scaffolding of a carefully constructed lie begin to collapse under the weight of its own cowardice. She told you, I said. Not a question. A statement. A confirmation of the thing I'd known would happen the moment I left that patio and saw the panic in Eleanor's eyes. Claire didn't answer immediately, but I saw the shift in her shoulders, the slight bend in her spine, as though the ground beneath her had tilted just enough to make her question her footing. She told me something, she said, slower now, more guarded, more measured. But I want to hear it from you. So I told her. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. I laid it out plain and brutal, the paternity test, the letter, the implication that our father had always known, had chosen to raise her anyway, but had refused to shield our mother from the consequences of her own deceit. I told her I had gone to the house while Eleanor was out, that I had opened the box, that I had found what she had buried there all these years, and I watched Claire's expression shift from confusion to horror to something closer to betrayal. When I finished, she sat down slowly, as though her body had finally caught up to the emotional freefall she was experiencing. "You had no right," she whispered, her voice shaking, not with anger, but with something worse, disbelief. "You had no right to go through her things, to take something that wasn't yours and twist it into some kind of weapon." I looked at her, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel smaller in her presence. I didn't feel like the outsider, the lesser daughter, the one who had to explain herself to the golden child. I just felt tired. "I didn't twist anything," I said. "I opened a box. I read what was inside. And for the first time in my entire life, something actually made sense." She stood then, eyes wide, shoulders squared, but there was no fire in her voice, only desperation. "She told me last year," Claire said suddenly, her words rushed, as though she'd been holding them in for too long and now couldn't contain them. "She told me she had an affair, that Dad wasn't mine biologically. She made me promise not to say anything to you. She said it would destroy you, that you wouldn't be able to handle it." I laughed. I didn't mean to. It just came out short, bitter, involuntary. "Destroy me?" I repeated. "Claire, I've been destroyed since I was 6 years old. I've been surviving in the rubble she left behind when she decided you were the child she wanted, and I was the one she had to learn to tolerate. Do you have any idea what that does to a person? To grow up being the mirror no one wants to look into, the evidence of everything she resented about herself." Claire shook her head, not in denial, but in some quiet refusal to accept the truth she had been complicit in, whether she meant to or not. "I didn't know," she said. "I mean, I knew, but I didn't understand what it meant. I didn't think it mattered." "Of course it mattered," I said, and this time my voice did shake. "It always mattered. It mattered when she praised you for breathing and punished me for existing. It mattered when she told me I was too emotional, too intense, too much. It mattered when Dad died and I was the one who had to sit alone at the funeral while you got handed a tissue box and 100 hugs. It mattered every single day I spent wondering why love felt like a prize I couldn't win." For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence between us wasn't peaceful or easy. It was raw, tense, filled with the weight of decades we could never get back. And then, quietly, Claire said something I wasn't prepared for. She said I was her second chance. It hit me harder than anything else she could have said, not because it excused what Eleanor had done, but because it confirmed everything I had ever felt, deep in the marrow of who I was. Claire hadn't been the golden child because she was better. She had been the golden child because she was the rewrite, the do-over, the version my mother could control, could mold, could hide behind. I nodded slowly, letting the truth of it settle between us like ash. Claire stood again, this time without anger or defense, just grief. Pure, human, complicated grief. "I don't know what to do with this," she said. "Neither do I replied. "But I'm not carrying it alone anymore." She left a few minutes later, her goodbye muted, uncertain, more of a pause than a conclusion. I didn't ask her to stay, and she didn't offer to. That wasn't where we were. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Later that night, as the sky turned that deep navy blue that always makes the world feel more honest, I lit a candle in the shop, opened my journal, and stared at the page for a long time before writing just one sentence. I never needed to be the golden child, I just wanted to be seen. The next day, Jake sent me another message. Just 5 words. "You win." I stared at it for a long time before replying. I don't know. Maybe I just broke even. And that was the truth. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt emptied out and wide awake, like someone who had finally found the thing that had been haunting her but wasn't sure what to do with it now that it had a name. I never confronted Eleanor again. I didn't need to. The damage was done, but more importantly, the illusion was shattered. And some illusions are worse than any truth. The last time I saw her, she looked smaller, quieter, like the weight of her own secrets had finally begun to settle on her shoulders in a way she couldn't ignore. She didn't apologize. She never would. But she knew I knew, and that, somehow, was enough. And maybe that's what closure really is, not forgiveness, not forgetting, not even understanding, but simply refusing to carry someone else's shame as your own. Let her keep her golden child. I have my truth now. And that, in the end, was the only light I ever really needed.